Here he is, children. Your hero, father.
Iran has a great leader. It was an accident. I didn't mean to kill him.
He brings shame to your house, Saddam. You think violence is a pastime?
Look what you're left with. Men who are nothing but afraid of you.
The downfall of a dynasty.
Sajid, go shopping.
House of Saddam. Wednesday at 9 on BBC Two.
All peoples of the world must realize that there is evil in our midst, and that wherever we may live, we cannot ignore developments in other parts of the world. Whilst we need to be vigilant to deal effectively with threats of terrorism, it is only through international cooperation and systematic effort that we can contain and deprive these terrorists of their sanctuaries.
The Today programme, weekdays 6 till 9, Saturdays from 7 on BBC Radio 4.
Now on BBC Two with Newsnight and Newsnight Review, it's Kirsty Walk.
Barry George is cleared of Jill Dando's murder, where the scales of justice weighted against him from the start. Tonight, a free man after 8 years in jail.
We've been fighting for many years. Now we need time to get back together as a family.
The prosecution said only Barry George could have murdered Jill Dando because of the sort of person he was. Tonight, as the jury disagrees, we ask how reliable is so-called bad character evidence.
We'll speak to Sean Jenkins, also freed after a murder conviction was overturned. No verdict on the only men charged in relation to the July 7th bombings, but new footage revealing what the bombers did.
Have you heard there's a shortage of broad beans? No? Well, there isn't one. A full report later.
And then on Newsnight Review at 11, Daredevil acts and Russian masterpieces reworked. As Jeremy Greer, Echo Eshin and Emma Gladstone join me to discuss Tracy Emin's artistic life laid bare in a major retrospective.
Is this it? Is this all I've done? You know, is this good enough?
The man who walked a wire between the Twin Towers, Frenchman Philippe Petit.
If I die, what a beautiful death.
On-stage drama as Katie Mitchell reimagines The Idiot, starring Ben Whishaw and Hattie Morahan. And a Chinese cultural extravaganza. Swan Lake explodes at the Lowry. Good evening. Barry George left the Old Bailey today unwilling to face the crowds. He had spent 8 years in jail for the murder of Jill Dando and had always maintained his innocence. Today, the jury at his retrial found him not guilty. The prosecution used so-called bad character evidence in their case, pointing to Barry George's personality, that of a fantasist and a stalker with mental disabilities. But the jury was not convinced of his guilt. So how flawed was the prosecution's case, and what will life now be like for Barry George? Here's Liz McKean.
We're really delighted to finally have justice. A huge thank you to the jury. They obviously worked very hard to ensure they correctly interpreted the circumstantial evidence in this case. We've been fighting for many years. Now we need time to get back together as a family. We also hope that the police will now look again into the murder of Jill Dando.
And so Barry George is free, 8 years after he was convicted of the murder of one of the country's best-known television personalities. His first trial was in 2001, 2 years after Jill Dando was shot dead outside her home. George was convicted after a single speck of gunpowder residue was found on his coat. He always denied the murder, and a member of the jury later spoke out against the verdict.
I just couldn't see that from the evidence that had been presented that personally, the way I looked upon it, I thought the evidence, didn't make me conclude that there was no shadow of a doubt that he did it. In fact, it was the other way. I thought, well, it didn't prove that he'd done it at all. So I was very shocked. and quite distraught about it.
Supported by a sister convinced of his innocence, Barry George was allowed an appeal a year later, but the conviction was upheld. 5 years later, a second appeal heard new testimony that undermined the forensic case. A new trial was ordered in which the gunpowder evidence played no part. The jury in Barry George's second trial was presented with a very different case. Since his conviction, the law had been changed, allowing evidence of bad character to be brought. This allowed the prosecution to build their case around the personality of a man who even the defence counsel accepted was seen as the local nutter. Barry George was arrested a year after the killing. At his home, less than half a mile from where Jill Dando lived, police found magazines and articles about female TV personalities. He was obsessed with celebrities like Freddie Mercury and had an interest in guns. But none of this was exactly what lawyers would describe as hard evidence.
A lot of people don't understand that the new rule about bad character doesn't just mean that juries can be told about people's previous convictions. Other forms of misconduct, some of it quite minor, can be included now in criminal trials. And indeed, this was the case in the Barry George case. There was no evidence of convictions, it was just evidence of his odd behaviour on street corners.
2 witnesses had seen a man running from the murder scene, yet they weren't able to identify Barry George. The one witness who could place him on Jill Dando's street had seen him there hours before the shooting. Campaigners believe that Barry George's only offence was that he was odd, and bad character evidence can harm the vulnerable. In the end, it was the character of Barry George that led to his successful defence. A man of low IQ, epileptic, prone to memory lapses. This, said the defence, was not someone capable of carrying out a crime so immaculate it was originally put down to a gangland hit or even a foreign assassin. Jill Dando was killed by a single shot as she returned home in broad daylight. No DNA evidence was recovered and the weapon has never been found. His defence suggested it was the perfect crime, requiring meticulous planning. But George's IQ put him in the lowest 5% of the population. He simply didn't have what it took.
We have 7 other cases coming up behind Mr. George's where this issue is going to be raised and raised by us. And they are all people with learning disabilities and various types of disabilities who've been convicted in the courts. All, I have to say, unfortunately, of murder, and all the cases are ones we've got serious concerns about.
The presenter was killed at the height of her fame, apparently without motive. Police found no clues in her private life. Any connection to Crime Watch, her most high-profile show, was ruled out. Some believe her celebrity sent police in the wrong direction.
The investigators involved had this terrible challenge of dealing with the media and thinking about the Serbian links and all sorts of connections that come through a person who is a celebrity. So they had those challenges, and unfortunately the police at the moment don't really have a logical system of working through the possibilities. They have to follow what seems sensible at the time, rather than what we as scientists would say was the most likely probability, and following from that.
Jill Dando was filmed by CCTV just before she went home where her killer was waiting. Tonight, their identity still unknown. An exhaustive police investigation lies in ruins.
Liz McKee, well, I'm joined now from Manchester by Jeremy Moore, Barry George's solicitor, and by Sean Jenkins, whose conviction for the murder of Billy Joe Jenkins was overturned. First of all, Jeremy Moore, you have been Barry George's solicitor for 4 years. In that time particularly, but overall in 8 years in jail, what was the impact on him of being in jail?
Well, you have to remember that for any individual, spending 8 years in high security conditions in a Category A prison is extremely difficult. He's locked up in his cell for most of the hours of the day, has very little contact with other individuals, but particularly for him with his psychological difficulties, it has been particularly very difficult time for him.
And his first reaction to the acquittal earlier today was obviously relief, but you've spoken to him since, and what does he say?
Very little really, but he's obviously overwhelmed with everything. Obviously it's hard to take in. He's just starting to try and make something of his life and to begin his new life back in the community. So, but it's very early days. It will obviously take him some time to get used to being free again.
For you, Sean Jenkins, you had to deal with that kind of re-entry into life outside prison. But what were those years like in prison for you? Because Barry George, like you, maintained his innocence completely and totally and constantly.
Well, it was traumatic. I mean, I entered a world that I knew nothing about, and just a different way of operating, different kinds of people. I had been a free man, and suddenly I was surrounded by rules and a regime that in many ways my life hadn't prepared me for. So the psychological and emotional pressure of that is something that I wouldn't want to wish on anyone. And at the same time, when you are an innocent person in prison and having to fight that as well on top of everything else is really traumatic.
So your reaction on release, I mean, euphoria presumably, but what was it like being outside at first? Was it disorientating?
It was very disorientating, although it was more disorientating for me when I was finally acquitted. When I had my conviction quashed, I then left Belmarsh and was on bail. But I held myself together because I knew I was going to have to face another trial. But when I heard the judge say that not guilty should be put on the indictment, 11 years just passed before me, and I gave thanks to God to what had happened.
Jeremy Moore, how did the police and authorities deal with the fact of Barry George's vulnerability when they were dealing with him?
I don't think very much account at all was taken of his vulnerability. Of course, when he was in the police interview, he had to have an appropriate adult with him, but thereafter, I think very little consideration was taken of that. In fact, it was used against him as evidence in his trial. Used against him? Explain that, please. Well, the case the prosecution put was that this was a case carried out by a loner, by some local...
Yes, the bad character, yeah.
That's right, indeed.
So that also happened to you, Sean Jenkins, in a different way, but that whole idea that bad character was part of the prosecution case.
Well, I mean, that's very true, although I'd also say, just pick up on something you said about, in the case of Barry George, him being vulnerable, but I'd also say that many men and women are in a vulnerable position when they've been charged with murder. I mean, your life suddenly falls apart at that particular point, and actually dealing with life around you actually becomes very impossible. You are a vulnerable person, surrounded by police often, looking to get a prosecution, and you have to rely on those around you to help you.
That question of relying on those around you to help, what you didn't have, but what Barry George has had is his family, which must have been a huge support to him. But just, I want to talk about the impact of such a high-profile case in a moment. But Jeremy Moore, just to continue this idea of the vulnerability, in the end, that did for the prosecution, didn't it? Trying to harness everything to bad character.
Well, indeed. I mean, the prosecution were able to adduce evidence in this trial as a result in the change in the legislation of what they called his bad character, which essentially was evidence of him, what they say was stalking women. In fact, what it amounted to was him, his inappropriate trying to chat up random women in the streets, but fell far short of anything that was suggested in the evidence in this case, or the allegation that was against him.
But when you look now, he's outside, it's a high-profile case, there are always going to be people who are going to challenge the verdict, even perhaps to his face. What will the impact of that be?
Well, obviously every case will stand on its merits, but he's had two trials. He's had a trial before a jury on the evidence, and really there was no evidence before the jury that was capable of convicting him.
Sean Jenkins, how do you deal with that in a way of advice?
Okay, I need to correct you on something first. You said that Barry George had his family and I didn't. What I didn't have was my ex-wife. What I did have were my parents and the rest of my family. Everybody needs somebody.
My mistake. But just very briefly, on advice on dealing with the people that no matter the evidence, no matter the conviction being overturned, no matter that you're a free man as Barry George is, how do you deal with these people?
Well, you have to believe, you have to work with your legal team, and you have to work with your family and persevere and hold to that belief that justice will actually come.
Thank you both very much. A jury at Kingston Crown Court couldn't reach a verdict today on the only 3 defendants to be charged in connection with the devastating bombings in July 2005. The 3 men had been accused of conspiracy to cause explosions. They were friends of the bombers, attending the same mosque and gym. The court was shown video footage of one of the defendants in the company of the bombers, but the jury was not convinced of their involvement in the atrocity. Richard Watson reports.
Wahid Ali, Sadir Salim and Mohammed Shakil were accused of helping the London bombers prepare their attacks of 7th of July 2005. They didn't deny being old friends of some of the bombers. Here's Wahid Ali joking around with the bomber Hasib Hussein in a video shown during the trial. And here's Shazad Tanweer, another of the 7/7 bombers filmed at the same time. Just after dawn on the 17th of December 2004, the 3 defendants drove down from Leeds to London. Hasib Hussein was with them in the car. They met Jermaine Lindsay, another of the bombers, in the capital. In court, they said they visited the London Eye, the Natural History Museum and the London Aquarium as tourists. But the prosecution had alleged that mobile phone records showed they were focusing on the locations which were bombed in the 7th of July attacks. But there were no CCTV images of the men, and the jury could not decide where the truth lay. Extraordinary new evidence emerged about the London bombers during the trial. The jury was shown this home video of Mohammed Sadiq Khan saying goodbye to his infant daughter before he left for Pakistan in November 2004. He appeared not to expect to return. Shazad Tanweer joined him in Pakistan.
I just wish if I could have been part of your life, especially these next few months were really special with you learning to walk and things. I just so much wanted to be with you, but I have to do this thing for our future.
The jury was told that Wahid Ali and Sadir Salim also went to a training camp in Pakistan at about this time, and Mohammed Shakil had been in Afghanistan with the leader of the London bombers in 2001. But all the men denied knowing anything about any plans for an attack on London. Much new evidence about the London bombings, unconnected to the defendants, emerged during the trial. These photographs were shown in court of a bomb factory in Leeds. A gas mask was used to control fumes when preparing the explosives, which were kept cool in the bath. This is the actual to-do list recovered from the flat, a chilling insight into final plans. There are entries for boiling to concentrate the explosives, and ice packs and sun blinds for the car to keep the bombs cool. There's even a reference to shrapnel, so more people would die. The jury were also shown new surveillance footage of a reconnaissance trip to London made just a week before the London bombings. This did not involve the men in the recent trial. Other new material emerged from the actual day of the attacks. Here Hasib Hussein fills up with petrol on the drive down, and here the bombers can just about be seen with rucksacks filled with explosives at Luton Station, where they took a train to King's Cross. They were picked up on CCTV arriving at the height of the rush hour. These extraordinary images from CCTV cameras at Aldgate East Tube Station were shown during the trial. Passengers caught in the rush hour crush moments before Shazad Tanweer, who was on this train in the second carriage, detonated his device. You can see smoke drifting across the platform. And these shots of bomber Hasib Hussein wandering around King's Cross Station, perhaps after his bomb had failed to explode, are also new. He puts the rucksack laden with explosives down in a shop just before he buys a 9-volt battery, possibly to make another attempt to detonate the bomb. After leaving King's Cross, he boarded a bus. Look carefully as the red bus passes outside, moments before it exploded, sending people diving for cover. "13 people were murdered here.
Your democratically elected governments continuously perpetuate atrocities against my people all over the world, and your support of them makes you directly responsible."
A wealth of new information emerged about the London bombings during this trial, but the jury was unable to conclude whether the evidence they heard amounted to a plan to support the attacks which killed 52 people on the 7th of July 2005. The accused may yet face a retrial, and a decision on this will be made in September.
We are at war, and I'm a soldier. Now you too will taste the reality of this situation.
And Richard joins me now. First trial of anyone alleged to be connected with the July 7th bombings, and now presumably no future prospect of any other arrests.
Well, yeah, deeply frustrating, obviously, for the victims of the 7/7 bombings and also the survivors who've been looking to some sort of trial to seek some resolution. But I mean, it has to be said, the jury clearly struggled with this one. They deliberated long and hard over it. They weren't able to come to any sort of firm conclusion after those deliberations. And I think part of it must be really looked at in the context of some of the evidence that was relied upon by the prosecution. I mean, the prosecution case hinged on, really, it turned on an alleged reconnaissance trip in December 2004 when the 3 men from Leeds travelled down to London and went to a number of places such as the London Eye and the London Aquarium. Now, the prosecution made great play of this. They said that mobile phone records really tied them to some of the places that were bombed 6 months later. But the evidence was quite circumstantial in a way. There was no CCTV evidence whatsoever, so the Crown, relying on this rather circumstantial evidence, and as I say, the jury clearly weren't able to come to any conclusion. I think there will be a retrial, though.
It did emerge during the trial that these 3 men had radical views.
Yeah, it's interesting this. It does raise a very interesting point because this is not really disputed. It wasn't disputed in the trial. For example, Wahid Ali, one of the defendants, he admitted in court that he had been in Afghanistan with Mohammed Sadiq Khan, the leader of the London bombers, in 2001. He was quite open about the fact that in 2005 he also attended a camp in Pakistan. So the fact that he held radical views, perhaps, isn't really in dispute here. However, one has to remember that the jury weren't being asked to judge whether these trips took place to Pakistan. They were being asked to judge a very specific allegation, which was that these men knew that their colleagues were going to bomb London, which is a very serious charge indeed. Now, clearly, after weighing up all this sort of evidence, they decided that they couldn't reach the benchmark of beyond reasonable doubt on that, and hence we had a hung jury. This does raise a very interesting broader point, really, this difference between being a radical political Islamist and a terrorist. There is a clear difference here, and it's clear that the jury came down on one particular side today.
Richard Watson, thank you very much. Before we move on, a quick word about next week in the run-up to the launch of the Beijing Olympics. We have a series of special reports, and we start by asking what the world thinks of China. Rupert Winfield Hayes investigates if the Games have opened up Chinese society.
Okay, that was extraordinary. I can say honestly, I've never seen the police in China behave like that before. Every time I've been stopped by the police before in China, you get taken to the police station, you get questioned for 2 hours, you have your tapes taken away. It can often be quite an unpleasant experience. And that's it. They checked our documents and they've gone. I can only say this has to be because of the Olympics.
And Paul Mason will be looking at how a cacophony of internet networking sites is changing China. Now, Newsnight sometimes enters the world of the sublime, and for that matter, the ridiculous. But we pride ourselves on thorough investigation, whatever the story. And this one, from our culture correspondent Stephen Smith, is all about bean stalks.
Yes, there's breaking news. There are crawls, I gather. But where else but here are you going to find a reassuring report on a crisis which you haven't heard of yet, and in fact isn't actually a crisis? I speak of the missing broad beans. It all began with a letter in today's Guardian.
On Sunday, I attempted to buy some frozen broad beans in my local Waitrose, only to be told that they no longer seem to sell them. Somewhat miffed, I then went to my local Sainsbury's, only to receive the same answer. So I went to Tesco's, and again I was rebuffed. Is it a nationwide conspiracy, or is there a more mundane answer?
The centrality of vegetables to our island story has been shown time and again, as in the 1987 classic Withnail and I.
I think you've been punished enough. I think we'd better release you from the legume and transfer your talents to the meat.
So how could the broad beans just disappear? Experts say it's because it's been so wet, unless it's because it's been so dry.
Maybe too cold and too wet, or too hot and too dry.
Come on, mate, make your mind up.
You've had a period when it might have been too hot and too dry, or too wet and too cold.
Look, it was too wet, all right.
2007 was a difficult growing year across the UK, and vining peas, garden peas are in short supply, and broad beans are no different.
Yes, of course, we have no bananas. We have no bananas today.
But it's all very rum and queer, because when we toured the souks and bazaars today, we were practically falling over broad beans. What's happening in the crazy world of the broad bean at the moment?
Beans, they're fantastic. This time of year they're English, so they're a good buy, good value for money. They're at the cheapest they're probably going to get for the whole of the season. So now's the time really to eat them.
I'm not aware of the great broad bean crisis, no.
Is that something that's likely to keep you awake at night, do you think?
Unlikely.
We contacted the country's leading grocers, and it was the same story.
I can confirm we have no shortage of frozen broad beans.
But at last the engorged pod of doubt released the hard pellet of truth. There are plenty of fresh beans because the weather's been good this year, but last year's crop suffered from heavy rain before it could be frozen.
We do not currently have any frozen broad beans, as much of last summer's harvest was affected by flooding. However, we do have fresh broad beans in all stores and will have frozen broad beans back in stock in the coming weeks.
If we get the right conditions the next few weeks, there should be a good crop of beans, and beans should be more available.
Let the others cover the disasters. We report the crises that haven't really happened and are over now anyway. Been there, done that.
Stephen Smith, our bean counter. In a moment, Tracy Emin on Newsnight Review, but first, a roundup of today's headlines. A top American government scientist has committed suicide after learning he was about to be indicted by US prosecutors investigating the 2001 anthrax killer case. Bruce Ivans was suspected by the FBI of being involved in the attacks in which anthrax-filled letters were mailed to politicians and journalists, killing 5 people and starting a widespread panic. And I'm joined now by our Washington correspondent, James Kuruasamy. First of all, this has been a shocking end to an extraordinary investigation.
That's right, Kirsty, an incredible twist at the end of this case, which, if you remember, it sowed complete confusion here in Washington soon after the September the 11th attacks. Of course, the initial suspicion was this was more from Al-Qaeda, but soon the government decided that this was a mad scientist theory, if you like, and they looked at a government laboratory where they worked on anthrax, a laboratory working on military matters, and they settled on one man called Stephen Hatfield, and for years he was the prime suspect in this. He was named as a person of interest. Well, it turned out he was not the man behind it. Just a few weeks ago, the government settled up with him, paid nearly $6 million to him in compensation. It appears clear that they were really closing the net around this man, Bruce Ivans, a very well-respected, a quiet scientist himself. Ironically, he'd worked on that investigation. And as you say, just a few days ago, it seems he committed suicide.
So is that the end of the story?
Well, I suppose the big question now is, do the government believe that this man was acting alone? His lawyers maintain his innocence. They say that he essentially was hounded to his death because of this investigation. The government at the moment being circumspect, they are saying simply that the investigation has got new evidence. We're waiting to see whether or not they close it or whether or not they continue, but there's been a mixed reaction from victims and families, some of them seeing closure in this, others being very frustrated, believing that this man may have taken the secrets of what motivated him, if indeed it was him, to the grave.
James, thank you. Shares in the electricity producer British Energy have fallen 4% after a proposed takeover by the state-owned French company EDF stalled. The deal, which would have seen EDF take over 8 of the UK's nuclear power stations, broke down because 2 major shareholders, Invesco and the Prudential, refused to accept the £12 billion offer. The government insists it will still press ahead with building new nuclear power stations. The Scottish Labour leadership will be a 3-way fight. Former Ministers Ian Gray, Cathy Jimison and Andy Kerr will contend the top job following the resignation of Wendy Alexander in June. And the markets, the FTSE 100 share index was down, suffering a late fall after poor US economic data. In New York, the Dow Jones closed down against the euro. The pound was slightly down against the dollar. The pound was also down. Tomorrow morning's front page is now, and of course, the story of Barry George on the front page of the Daily Mail. Innocent. The man's convicted of Jill Dando's murder is freed after 7 years, so who did do it? The Daily Telegraph, Jill Dando's killer may never be found. On the story down there on the right-hand side, Miliband job swap, and a possibility here that he will swap jobs with the Chancellor, Alistair Darling, in a cabinet reshuffle next month. That's, of course, pure speculation. The Independent, not guilty, so who did kill Jill Dando? The Guardian, a whispered thank you, and Barry George walks free. And down at the bottom there, apparently Harriet Harman said, we have not agreed to Thatcher's state funeral. And finally on the Daily Express, £1 million payout for Dando killer. So who did kill the TV star? Time now to join my guests for Newsnight Review to discuss A Man on a Wire, Dancers on Wires and Women on the Edge. Return to the unmade bed. Emin at the National Galleries of Scotland. Does 20 years of Tracy still produce a shock?
I always said the reason why nuns sew is to stop them from masturbating, and I think it's the same with me. While I'm sewing, I'm not getting into mischief.
Skyscraping in New York. The man who walked between the Twin Towers.
A quarter of a second of inattention and you lose your life.
Dostoevsky's The Idiot, deconstructed in Katie Mitchell's Some Trace of Her at the National in London. And A Bird on a Wire, trick cyclists, acrobats and some extreme valley in a Chinese swan lake at the Salford Lowry. And our balancing act tonight, the academic Jermaine Greer, the director of the ICA, Echo Eschen, and sadder as well, producer and former dancer, Emma Gladstone. Tracy Emin is one of Britain's most famous artists who lays bare her life, love and loss in every stitch or neon sign, brushstroke or painful piece of her detritus. Perhaps we think we know her after 20 years of her work. Her most notorious piece is still her unmade bed when she was a Turner Prize nominee, and last year she represented Britain at the Venice Biennale, a high honour that won her a mixed reception. But we've never seen all of Tracy. This weekend, the first major retrospective of 20 years of her work opened at the National Galleries of Scotland in Edinburgh. Tracy Emin gave me a preview of the show, which features characteristically strong language. What's the experience of putting together, as it were, a big retrospective for you been like?
Well, last week I was kind of slightly euphoric at the idea of just having a really big show in Britain anyway. Then when I started looking at things that I haven't seen for like maybe 10 or 15 years, the time thing hit in, and I realised that I'm 45 now, so in 15 years' time I'll be 60. And then I started questioning, where has the time gone? Is this it? Is this all I've done? You know, is this good enough? So it's kind of a bit strange. It's a bit of a roller coaster.
The blankets are the kind of contrast between the incredibly muscular language and almost aggression with the delicacy of sewing. Because it's like you.
This is really rude. I always said the reason why nuns sew is to stop them from masturbating, and I think it's the same with me. While I'm sewing, I'm not getting into mischief. And it's brilliant. When I have a show, you have coach loads of women from Women Institute and stuff like that coming and looking at how I've sewn it, and I've seen them start talking about the chain stitch and the blanket stitch and the applique and the different fabrics and the overlaying and everything. So it's great. Women then can have their own language. These are a new series of paintings which are over the last year or so, and they're really fresh and they're really alive, and they're about being alive. So often when I was younger, I'd do a painting and I'd get to a certain stage and it wasn't finished, but I think, to me, it's so finished. I wish I could just leave it there, but I never did. I killed it. And now I have the confidence to leave it there.
You put the bed together fresh each time. Fresh, not maybe the right word, but has anything changed about the bed?
I was unpacking it and I couldn't believe it, because this is stuff from 10 years ago, and 10 years ago relationship, 10 years ago stains, 10 years ago stains in underwear, 10 years ago kind of like wild life as well, which I'm just not like that anymore.
More than anyone else, working as an artist today, you know, anything in your life can be recycled into art. This is about your life. When you look at this and then you think, what's my life going to be like in the next 40 years? Do you think that your art will be as confessional?
In a year's time, I do not know what I'll be showing. I do not know what I'll be doing. And as an artist, that's a really exciting, dangerous, scary place to be in. But it's fantastic, because most artists, you're on a treadmill. There's an expectation, there's a demand. We want another blanket. Can she do another bed? We want another tent. If I could have remade my tent, would have been paid at the time £1 million. And I said, no, of course I can't remake it. I want to make something new, and something new of my life as well.
Do you think you're more mellow now?
No, I thought I was. I really thought I was, but I'm really not. I'm totally not. What you see is the bit that I'm giving you. Inside, it's like a volcano waiting to put it into my art. If I channel it all into my art, everything's okay. It's me. It's my saviour in lots of ways. It's fantastic.
Jeremy, is that the sense that you get, that art is our saviour?
Well, it was interesting what she said there about a volcano, because the thing that got me this time that I've not noticed before was the feeling that there is an extraordinary self-censorship going on. You know, everybody thinks, oh, Tracy lets it all hang out. She just told you then that she doesn't. And you know that any artist doesn't. That narrative is not confessional, it's a constructed narrative. And she has never taken her eye off that. She decides to destroy 10 years worth of paintings, so she photographs them all first. Amazing, huh? They're destroyed but not destroyed. She knew she wasn't much of a painter as well, and I rather suspect she'll turn out not to be much of a painter. It doesn't matter. But what concerns me is the rage that is in her from the incredible set of traumas that she suffered from the time she was a small child. That is itself not a creative force. It doesn't produce art. It produces self-harming. It produces suicide. It produces all that other stuff. So as long as the art, in a way, decoys her from becoming hypnotised by her feeling of grievance. But the thing is, there's not going to be a baby, Trace, I'm telling you now. It's going to be very strange if she suddenly finds it possible to become pregnant at this stage of the game. And the baby won't do it for her either. So that all her myths are going to be put to the test by menopause, I reckon.
Echo.
Well, I think what makes her an artist is the fact that she isn't splurging out her life and just on the page. This isn't confessional work. I agree with Jermaine. What Tracy can do, and we call her Tracy because we have such a relationship with work, what she can do is work with the stuff, the terrible, actually, facts of a childhood life, raped at 13, and various other terrible things. But she's managed to work those things and work with those subject matters for 20 years and still keep a directness, still keep a visceral effect with her work. I mean, I think her work is amazingly powerful because it feels so direct, even though each time she's giving you different slices, almost the same puzzle.
I think that's what impressed me. Was I knew of her and I knew some of her work, but to go and see that stretch of body of work, not only to see the range of materials that she was working in, but how she was developing. So the early painting, there's the room when she'd gone and shut herself up to try and paint, and it doesn't work. It's sort of there in its entirety, but it doesn't work. And there's later paintings that are so much more interesting, and that potential is there. And the way that the sewing has developed in the colours or the fonts, the humour that's in it that goes all the way through, there's so much more there than the sex.
Well, yeah, except I would say the censorship gets greater. As the colour leaches out of the blankets and the spelling is organised and she learns which way round an N goes, they're not doing it for her anymore in quite the same way. They're not sizzling.
And yet one of the later blankets, the one there about peace, which she did in response to September the 11th, I think that's one of her more powerful works. It's quite a political work. She invests a lot in it. It's not just necessarily about her, it's about wider society. In a sense, that's one of her less self-aware works. It's one that actually brings on I think that's a terrific piece of art.
There's a lot there that goes wider, I think. And I also think there's one in blanket that's an embroidery that looks like one of the monoprints called, I think, Oh Fuck Her, I think it's called. And that I thought was extraordinary because it's like a cartoon, but it's done in stitching. So that development is seen in how she's going beyond the letters. She's using one of the other forms that are more urgent and more violent, and puts it into the tapestry.
That she recycles her best drawings, and they're becoming fewer and further between, and she's trying to create that
yeah, but the thing is,
sprezzatura, and it's not happening.
I don't buy the notion of censorship. You know, you're looking at 20 years of an artist's work, but it doesn't mean we've arrived at a finish point. It doesn't mean we've arrived at an end. It means there's a continuing development that goes on. I mean, that's what's interesting to me. We see so many different aspects of work, you know, from painting to monotypes to text to sculptures to the found object, which is the bed, all of these different things. And I don't get a sense somehow that she's run out of steam, or in fact that she's censoring herself. I
didn't mean to put it quite like that. I think she is still being very well behaved.
Do you think she's created a language for women? I mean, she was talking particularly about the blankets there, but do you think she's done that?
Well, she might actually realise that other people have been speaking that language for rather a long time.
But you know what? I think one of the interesting things about her, she doesn't actually care that much about. There is a legacy of quite spiky feminist art that's been going, you know, for the last 3 or so decades. But she doesn't really care that much about it, because actually Tracy's one of the few artists I think that we can look at who's really interested in the world around her. She speaks a language that that you can understand, that you can pick up from gossip magazines, from confessional literature, from all sorts of different things. And I think the strength of her work is that she doesn't just speak to an art world. She speaks actually to many women who grew up who didn't read The Female Eunuch, and also who haven't had a sort of politicised upbringing, but have this kind of gutsy anger which she talks about in her work.
It is also interesting that the gutsiness is her discussion as a woman about sex, and that's something I find refreshing, because it's not done from an anti-male perspective. One of the drawings is called Praying for a Penis, and I just find the humour in it I find funny. The frankness I think is refreshing, and I think the honesty that's there, the fact that it's all about her I think does go wider, and I think it's refreshing. I feel the things that are more graphic and more sexual are definitely, I look at differently, because it's been made by a woman.
I think there's a bravery to her work, and I think there's a desire to be unfeminine, which doesn't mean she's not female, which doesn't mean she's not feminist, but she is quite happy not to be feminine, not to be pretty. She's happy to be brave, she's happy to be aggressive, she's happy to be coarse, all of these things which, traditionally women aren't supposed to do, aren't allowed to do, and she does them all, and she makes the work out of that, and that's why it's so powerful.
Tracy Emin, 20 years, continues at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art until November. There's already a heated debate about her art on the Newsnight blog, so do feel free to join it. The award of the Olympic Games to China has afforded the Chinese an opportunity to promote their culture abroad. In Britain, a 6-month festival of chinoiserie, China Now, is drawing to a close. It's encapsulated everything from a big design exhibition at the V&A to a return of the Gorillaz opera Monkey Journey to the West, which has formed the basis of the BBC's Olympic title sequence. 2 Chinese versions of Swan Lake have opened this week. We chose to take in the less traditional acrobatic version from the Shanghai City Dance and the Guangdong Acrobatic Troupe, which opened on Wednesday at the Lowry in Salford. that we chose the more exuberant Swan Lake. Did it translate to their approach?
It made for a very unforgettable evening, but I fear it was for the wrong reasons. One of the things I thought afterwards was why would they want to do it? That you can reconstruct Swan Lake like Makarova has just done with the National Ballet of China. You can reinvent it like Matthew Bourne has done with his version that's been touring for years. But to try and mix these two mediums, they're so opposite. I felt when they did just the circus, that's when it was at its strongest. The boy bouncing on the bamboo, the one bit of interesting choreography with the frog dance, the famous Signet quartet, which brought in choreography that no ballet dancers would be able to do or would want to do. But when it and when it goes to the ballet, it does also work. There's the main ballerina was really spectacular, I thought. The corps de ballet were very strong. But when they mix them, you then have situations where you have a famous pas de deux and suddenly the prince does a cartwheel. Or one of my favourite bits was when the corps de ballet, down the front, they're doing their thing, and suddenly a woman swings on behind and starts spinning really fast, going up to the ceiling, hanging on to this thing by her teeth. And I just found the juxtaposition between the two was really like oil and water. I so wanted to like it, but I found myself laughing for the wrong reasons.
Jermaine?
Yeah, well, see, my problem is I think of them as the right reasons, because I just can't stand ballet. Because that sort of middle-class Russian flummery nonsense with ridiculous tales and absurd physical language and titter-titter-titter attitude, titter-titter-titter arabesque, can't stand it. And so the funnier they made it, the more outrageous. You think you can do an arabesque? Watch this. Oriental swan ballet on top of head coming your way. I was just so delighted as a child who
We're going to see this now. Let's have a look at this right now.
Loved it.
Now this apparently this is a married couple. They can only do this, these two. Look at her. She's on point, on his head, with about to do a hyperextension with her other leg.
But then she goes and sets it straight up.
Yes, I mean, I think she's about to do it now, and it was extraordinary, wasn't it?
But look at that!
Yay!
But look at the costumes of the guys next to her. It's like something out of Matthew Barney, standing right beside her. This is what I couldn't get past, was these costumes. It was like a mixture of the Rio Carnival,
it was like burlesque,
Matthew
wasn't
Barney.
it?
We had a bit of Ballet Trocadero de Monte Carlo in there. You had everything.
There are moments of high farce, there's no plot, it doesn't hang together, it's kind of vaguely ridiculous, but you'd have to be completely hard-hearted not to enjoy it. Because, it's crazy, and it was really funny, and it was kind of enjoyable, because it was such a feat of ridiculous endurance and impossibility, and people flying across poles, and, it hasn't really got very much to do with Swan Lake, but it doesn't mean it doesn't make for a great entertainment piece.
But I felt that they both fell through the net. The circus wasn't really. There's lots of points in Swan Lake when there's great chances to do the Spanish dance or the mazurka, whatever it is, and they could have made more of that, I thought. And the ballet just doesn't add up. Suddenly the girls are coming on with roller skates underneath their long classical dresses. You're left really just absolutely gobsmacked.
You think they were doing it in an ironic way? I just thought they were doing it in a kind of exuberant. I didn't think there was irony.
Well, there's everything in there. I mean, the Chinese are remarkable people. The one thing I kept thinking was, when they are world dominant, things won't be so bad.
But you know what? It's an exercise in a completely different aesthetic because it isn't polite at all. And there's a slight low moment when the prince goes looking for the princess and he goes across ancient Egypt, and we know it's Egypt with the pyramids, and then he goes riding past on a stuffed camel, and you do wonder what's going on. But at the same time as that, sheer pleasure, sheer thrills, sheer joy, sheer physical presence, and what's so bad about that?
I mean, when you look, as you say, the corps de ballet, now we've got other dancers who are on point, except they're on point on stilts. I did think this was slightly bizarre.
Well, I mean...
well, why not? Being on point is so ridiculous to start with. Just make it clear just how ridiculous this is.
One thing at the end was that you can see the cast's absolute joy at the applause they got. That was very affecting.
Yeah, well, exactly. That's the thing. I mean, you know, I kind of agree with Jermaine's point. You know, you have to break out of the politeness a little bit. You have to break out of the aesthetic constraints a little bit. Yes, there's a lot of hat tossing. Yes, there's a lot of juggling and tumbling. Well, so be it. You know, it's a kind of good night out. And I think as long as you kind of understand,
there's also the feeling it's a bit like lion taming. That if one of them gets it wrong, they're going to be shocked.
Yeah, to be honest, that's actually what a lot of the tension was about. You really didn't want that kid to fall off that pole. You just didn't. When he was leaping through the air, you wanted it to go okay.
Well, he's going to have to do a lot more leaping because Swan Lake continues at the Lowry in Salford until Saturday, then moves to the Royal Opera House in London, and then it moves on to the Royal Concert Hall in Nottingham. And we'll have more high-wire action at the end of the programme and a film about the man who walked between the Twin Towers. Well, the theatre director Katie Mitchell is a restless spirit, constantly seeking different ways to present the stage. Usually they were deploying cameras and all the mechanics of film, video and photography in a reimagining of classic texts. It's an approach that polarises the critics. Her latest play for the National in London, Some Trace of Her, is based on Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot, boiled down, she says, to around 60 pages. Hattie Morahan, whom Mitchell has worked with on several productions, plays the doomed Natasha, and Ben Whishaw, the epileptic Prince Mishkin. They, along with 6 other actors, dash around the stage, setting up lights, cameras and props, and the images they create are instantly projected onto the screen above. Here is a scene from the play, filmed during rehearsals before it opened this week.
At times he felt he would have liked to go away somewhere, to disappear entirely, and he would not have minded going away to some gloomy and deserted spot to be alone with his thoughts, if only no one knew where he was. At moments he dreamt of the mountains, and one familiar spot in particular, a place he always liked to remember, from where he could look down on the village, on the faintly gleaming streak of the waterfall below, the white clouds, and the ruins of the ancient castle.
And of course one of the cast in charge of supplying the rain in that clip there. So this is the reworking of another Russian classic. Did you get the essence still of the story of The Idiot?
I think you did. I mean, I read The Idiot like 20 years ago or something, and you know, here this isn't a play that will give you the story. You have to work at it quite hard because it's a very disjointed story. But I really loved it. I was so impressed by what was happening here. I haven't seen any of Katie Mitchell's plays before, so I was kind of very new to what was going to happen. And halfway through it, I really realised what was going on. 2 things, crucially. One, this is a nervy, odd production. You have to work quite hard to follow the kind of script. The actors are scuttling around everywhere with cameras. And one thing is that it mirrors the kind of nervous tension and the sort of psychological unease of the story itself, of The Idiot itself. And then the other thing is that in the audience, you have a completely different experience to that which you normally do in the theatre, which is normally you sit back and watch the thing. Here, actually, you have to engage with it. Here, you have to be, as it were, a camera. You have to be a boom mic yourself. You have to be part of the production in order to figure out how to watch it, how to edit it, because there's several different multiple takes.
Well, working into that made me quite. I felt that quite stressful because I kept thinking, oh, are they going to make through to the next scene? Are they going to make that cut?
Well, the thing is, exactly, and you're wondering that, and you're wondering, well, where should I look? What should I be thinking about right now? So actually, suddenly, you're part of the play itself.
Jermaine?
I found it absolutely enchanting, because usually what you see in a play is a counterfeited action. It's actually totally phony. You don't sit at a table like that. You don't talk to people like that because you're talking past them. You're cheating and feinting and all the rest of it. And we've got so used to that dishonesty. And every time the theatre breaks out of that, every time it says, look, this is illusion, come round the back, watch this. In this case, it talked about all our ways of interpreting illusion in the cinema, on television, in the news. It was all about editing. It was all about getting us to understand that 3 separate pieces of action on the screen were the same sequence of events. And it was uniquely pleasurable because you could actually feel your mind stretching out to pull the pieces in and set them out. And I didn't mind what happened to the novel, frankly. I couldn't have given a toss.
No, I thought she managed to somehow draw in the essence of what the play was. I haven't read the book at all, but I felt what she'd done was totally take it apart with all the rigour that we know that she does in how she works, and put it together in a way which let you into their heads and into their souls. I mean, it really took me off onto such a different journey. I found it very bewitching. I came out, because I sort of listened to audiences endlessly for my job, I heard people saying, God, I find it so distracting watching the people make up, which I found utterly bewitching. I adored that overt construction in front of us, and I heard other people going, that was amazing, that was like making a film live in front of us. And I loved the medium, the mixing of the magic of the screen, which is always so enjoyable to look at. I mean, it's so magnetic to
and
look
what
at.
about, we can see that
the
screen,
live performance.
we can see the screen now. What was extraordinary was the way that the actors themselves were operating, obviously, the cameras. Each one was graded instantly.
Yeah.
And actually what you was created there was something that actually you could probably show beautifully.
Well, that's what I love, because film is normally such a fixed medium. It's given, you watch it as a static thing. And I love the fact that she was totally blowing that away by making, and they make it every night. They have to, they are redoing that every night.
Essentially the secret with this, you see on stage actors running around cameras and mics and stuff, but actually the real secret is who's doing the editing. Like, who's deciding actually what's on that screen. Because then you realise, in fact, that what you're seeing and what you're participating in is a whole bigger exercise in its own right.
But don't you think that Katie Mitchell's next step, logically, would actually be to make a film?
No,
absolutely
not. Absolutely no. The whole point about it is it's in the theatre.
Exactly.
It's happening now, and it will be different every night. It will never go into the can.
It can't even work watching the clips that we've seen.
No, hopeless.
No, it doesn't work.
Some trace of her continues in rep at the National Theatre until the 21st of October. In 1974, as New York's Twin Towers were being completed, a young Frenchman was putting the final parts of an audacious plan in place. 24-year-old Philippe Petit had dreamed of walking a high wire between the two buildings since their construction was planned. As he grew up, a trickster and pickpocket in France, he perfected his wire walking technique, walking without permission between the towers of Notre Dame and then over the Sydney Harbour Bridge. In a feature documentary full of amazing archive, Philippe Petit, now 60, recounts the meticulous planning that went into the smuggling of 450 pounds of cable and a crossbow into the towers so he could walk across the sky high above the teeming Manhattan streets.
And I had to make a decision of shifting my weight from one foot anchored to the building to the foot anchored on the wire. This is probably, I don't know, probably the end of my life to step on that wire. And on the other hand, something that I could not resist, and I didn't make any effort to resist, called me upon that cable. And death is very close.
Jermaine, do you agree with him that it was kind of the artistic crime of the century?
Well, I wonder. In a way, it's a mad hymn to the 60s in a way.
Not the 70s.
Well, in fact, the 60s were a lot later than anybody thinks. Nothing much started to happen before about 1966, and a lot of the best things happened, in fact, in the early 70s. It's the whole insane playfulness of it, and then the absolute seriousness about being playful. And this strange will-o'-the-wisp character sucks in these other men who work for him like slaves, and actually
to make his egotistical vision happen.
And then he's the one who dances on the wire, and then he drops them all and leaves them dangling.
Exactly. I'd have enjoyed this more, and it's a great, well put together documentary. But he's a monster. He's arrogant, he's egotistic, he's narcissistic, and you can see that. And the fact that he's so playful, so charming, actually disguises the fact that he's a complete egotist. And we see this at the very end of the.
Yeah, we're not necessarily going to give away the end, but it is a documentary, so we can sort of be there.
He's like the Artful Dodger. That's what he reminds me of. There is a complete pleasure in going where he shouldn't go, in going against the grain, in doing what's naughty. Even after he's walked between Sydney Harbour Bridges, he nicks he pickpockets the watch of one of the policemen.
I actually think there's a tension that is almost unresolved in the documentary about what the documentary makers actually want to do. You know, we see the myth and the realisation of his dream, and it's a fantastic thing. But then immediately he gets down from the wire, he's arrested by the police, and he comes out and he sleeps with someone who's not his girlfriend, and he's on camera laughing about this. Yeah, so I sleep with this woman. It's not so bad. And actually, and as Jermaine says, he dumps his friends, and you realise actually that his coming down off that wire is the other story, which isn't really told in here, but is the real story.
It doesn't reduce the power of what that documentary is, which is, I think, absolutely fantastic. There's another whole documentary there about what happens.
There's another documentary there, but do you separate the man from his art? In a sense, can you? You probably can't. But going back to the beginning, when he was, there's a lovely moment when he was crossing in Notre Dame, his girlfriend runs in, there's this huge service going on Notre Dame, she says, there's a man on top of the roof, and they all come running out to have a look at him. The archive was extraordinary, wasn't it? The archive was just amazing.
In fact, but the whole film is such a mosaic of different media that you keep having to. So there's reconstruction, there's archive, there's their home movie bits and pieces, alternating between grainy stuff on long lens and so on. And then there's Michael Nyman making this mad musical collage. You think, am I in the draftsman's contract? Oh, no, I'm not. Oh, it's the Lark Ascending.
What about this whole Twin Towers iconic thing at the beginning, where they sort of set it up as these men, they break into the Twin Towers, will they live, will they die?
I mean, it is very exciting, because actually, for the most part, it's constructed like a heist movie, so he gets together this oddball bunch of characters, and they're real-life characters, but they don't quite like each other or trust each other, and they do manage to pull off this, this great crime, and it's a and they call it le coup, and it's a fantastic coup. They do they do this thing, but I still come back to this thing that he manages to seduce all of these people, and actually seduce most people watching.
Emma, you want to jump in at the end?
No, just that I love the fact that they kept coming across things that would make it impossible, and they kept finding a way through, and the fact that they did achieve it, even those
friends...
And
he must have been picking a lot of pockets to go back and forth across the Atlantic as much as he did. Man on a Wire certificate PG-13 is at selected cinemas around the Cape. We've now got 30 seconds to find out what else has excited our guests this week. Jermaine?
My excitement was Nicholas Daniel playing the Elliott Carter oboe concerto at the proms on the telly.
Emma?
I was in Vienna looking at some work that we're bringing next year to the Wells on a festival on William Forsyth, and it was an installation with 3,000 balloons in the Viennese Parliament. It was fantastic.
I took part in an evening of talks and film screenings conducted by an artist called Will Holder to celebrate the 121st birthday of the great conceptual artist Marcel Duchamp.
There we are. Thanks to my guests, Jermaine Greer, Echo Eshna and Emma Gladstone. Newsnight Review is taking a summer break next week. We'll be back in September. The Edinburgh Festival show begins on BBC Two on Wednesday the 13th of August at 10 o'clock. Newsnight will kick off its season of China films next week, as we said, and we've got a whole selection of reviews of China-related culture on the Review website. And we leave you with some more from the Guangdong acrobatic Swan Lake. The 4 signets from the original are turned into 4 frogs here. Good night.
Every note. The BBC Proms, Sundays and Mondays at 7:30 on BBC 4.
Good evening. Bit of a mixed bag of weather across the UK this weekend. There will be some sunshine around, but equally some showers. That rain in the west of Scotland fragmenting through the morning. Showers getting going across Wales to the Midlands and the southwest. Quite a bit of cloud for the southern half of the UK. But into the afternoon, the cloud will begin to thin and break, and we should see some decent spells of sunshine coming through. 21 degrees, your top temperature. That's around about the 70 Fahrenheit mark. Not too bad. Scattering of showers, some of which could be quite heavy for Lincolnshire and East Anglia. Largely dry through Kent and Sussex, a bit breezy along the coast, and that'll be bringing in a fair bit of cloud with it. Head inland, a better chance of seeing some holes in that cloud, some spells of sunshine, and maybe a little bit of brighter weather there in Cornwall and Devon. Still breezy here, with the showers few and far between into the afternoon. A similar story across Wales, brightening up for the afternoon, just one or two passing showers. A similar story in Northern Ireland, but in Western Scotland, here it could well be a focal point for some fairly frequent showers, much brighter in the south and the east. Heading further afield for the weekend, well, you could well catch one or two showers in Amsterdam, some wetter weather in Paris and some rain too in Berlin, but head further south and we've got some sunshine, some pretty high temperatures, middle to high 30s in Madrid and not far off of that in Rome. For Sunday, Northern Ireland and Scotland will look pretty wet, I'm afraid, but for England and Wales, a good chance of some lengthy spells of sunshine, but equally there will be one or two showers. If you want more information, well, it's always there on the website. And how about BBCI, page 400?
I think that people are starting to understand that artists have a say, and what they say might just change the world as much as a politician can, or maybe a politician really can't.
The Today programme, weekdays 6 till 9, Saturdays from 7 on BBC Radio 4.
The space-age sound of the 70s now with a guide to one of Britain's most influential rock bands. Hawkwind, Do Not Panic, with strong language, now on BBC Two.
The 2008 Olympics, next Friday at 12:45 on the BBC.
3.
I've seen the reports.
The mass evacuation of London and surrounding areas.
Terrorists are getting younger, so you're probably looking for younger spies. Am I right?
I just wanted to be a doctor, and then I realised I didn't want to be a doctor anymore.
And what? You want to be some kind of action hero?
I know you mention it.
2 nuclear bombs.
What if they're planning another attack?
Anyone tell you? New world, new rules.
Brand new drama, Spooks Code 9, coming soon to BBC Free TV and online.
Here he is, children. Your hero, father.
Iroh is a great leader. It was an accident. I didn't mean to kill him. He brings shame to your house, Saddam. You think violence is a pastime?
Look what you're left with. Men who are nothing but afraid of you.
The downfall of a dynasty.
Sajid, go shopping.
House of Saddam, Wednesday at 9 on BBC Two.
Royal scandal as the king clashes with Rome and a poisonous plot unfolds. Explosive and erotic drama now on BBC Two and BBC HD, with scenes of a sexual nature from the outset. It's series 2 of The Tudors.